Canadian Neonatal Follow-Up Network, and in particular to share the results of our neurodevelopmental outcomes at 18 months of corrected age. And this is Vancouver, where I live. So today,
7 y 8 canal.
La traducción. Ay, la 7. El 7.
7.
7.
Sí.
are we okay?
Yes.
So in my talk, I would like to tell you about the how we developed the Canadian Neonatal Follow-Up Network, the 18-month outcomes of children born very preterm in Canada, what are the risk factors for adverse outcome, and to understand the implications of the definitions we have used to define impairment. So the Canadian Neonatal Follow-Up Network, and in French, Réseau Canadien de Suivi Néonatal, is a collaboration of all 26 neonatal follow-up programs in Canada. It developed in liaison with the Canadian Neonatal Network, which now includes all the NICUs in Canada, and we developed the follow-up network to collaborate in research, to develop a national database, to improve the outcomes of the children. And I was lucky to work with Dr. Shuley, who developed the Canadian Neonatal Network, to then develop this sister follow-up network. So, as most of you in this room probably know, that despite the improvement in the survival of very preterm babies, about 1/2 of them continue to experience one or more neurodevelopmental challenges. And we know from the United States, through the NICHD network, that they have considerable variations in neurodevelopmental outcomes, and we were wondering if the same applies in Canada. So our research questions were, what is the incidence of adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes of children born in Canada at less than 29 weeks gestational age, who were born in the 2.5-year period, April 1st, 2009 to September 30th, 2011? And what are the determinants, including site, of neurodevelopmental outcome rates? So this is a picture of Canada, and just like in Argentina, you have most of your population around Buenos Aires. You can see that we are mostly in the south, mostly on the east, and this is Vancouver here. So we were able to enroll all 26 sites and had funding for this 2.5-year period, and we were able to link the information to the neonatal data that's collected by the Canadian Neonatal Network. So it took us about 10 years, but we eventually agreed what information we were going to collect, which was to see the children in person when they're 18-month corrected age, and that we would collect information about their sociodemographics, about their health after NICU discharge, their growth, physical exam, including whether they have cerebral palsy or not, and how severe cerebral palsy is using the gross motor function classification system. And then we used the third edition of the Bailey to look at their development. I'm not going to present today, but we have also collected information at 3 years using a questionnaire about these children. So what did we do? The first thing we did was to develop a database, which was developed by clinicians working in follow-up clinics. And then we developed a manual of definitions. And if you're interested, this is available on our internet. You can see the website there. We then decided to develop a certification program for the different clinicians administering the Bailey by working with a publisher who is Pearson. So we already had this Canadian Neonatal Network collecting the neonatal information, and all the 26 follow-up programs were already recruiting babies, well, mostly recruiting babies less than 29 weeks gestation, so they continue to do that. And the CNN database created a unique identifier, and so the data abstractor then of CNN let the CN Fund follow-up sites know what that unique number was, so that they could then be able to load the information into a computer, which then got uploaded to our coordinating site, which is in Toronto. Okay, the information which was uploaded was de-identified with no names, hospital numbers, or anything else like that. And then there was a delay, but we would get from CNN which babies had been seen, and then we contacted the follow-up sites for the babies who had not been seen to try to improve our follow-up rate. Yeah. We have built into the database data verification so that we can minimize the number of errors. Okay. Now, everybody just wanted us to tell us how many of these children were impaired. And so what I did was to look at the different definitions being used around the world, and I decided to copy or imitate one being used by the British Association of Perinatal Medicine, and they distinguish between severe and broader neurodevelopmental impairment. And as you can see, they look at 5 criteria: motor, cognitive, language, hearing, and vision. And these were then the criteria we developed for severe, and these are the criteria for a more broader neurodevelopmental impairment. And as you see, severe on the Bailey score is generally less than 70, so that's worse than 2 standard deviations below the mean. And for neurodevelopmental impairment, we use 85, which is less than -1 standard deviation. To make sure we didn't lose the babies who might be so severely impaired that they couldn't be tested using the Bailey, what we did is the Bailey has a questionnaire they call a General Adaptive Composite Score, and we were able to use that to help classify those who couldn't be tested. And there were some children where the clinician said this child is in a very severe developmental delay, and we accepted that as well. So to then look at what were the determining factors of adverse outcome, we did 3 regression analyses. One looking at severe neurodevelopmental impairment. Secondly, neurodevelopmental impairment. And thirdly, either severe impairment or death. And then we did it in 5 steps, looking at patient characteristics and patient pregnancy complications. Then we looked at severity of illness using the SNAP score. Then we looked at NICU complications like bronchopulmonary dysplasia, retinopathy of prematurity, necrotizing enterocolitis. And then because we knew that severe brain injury defined as a grade 3 or 4 intraventricular hemorrhage or as a periventricular leukomalacia was correlated, we separated that out. And then at the end we looked at which NICU the baby was cared for. So in the 2.5 years, we had almost 4,000 patients admitted to our NICUs. Of these, just over 3,100 survived. Now, we did have 9% where we could not manage to link it, the CNN and CN Fund databases. And we had 22 babies who died after NICU discharge. So that left us with 2,810 survivors. And we had about 80% follow-up and ended up seeing 2,340 babies. Okay. This is a big table, but I just want to highlight what's in the bold, which is the difference between the babies who we had information on in our database and those that we did not have information on. As the babies in our database were slightly more premature, a lower birth weight, more likely to have received antenatal steroids, more likely to have had prolonged rupture of membranes, more likely to be twins or multiples, were more severely ill in the first day of life with a higher SNAP score, were more likely to have bronchopulmonary dysplasia, more likely to have late onset sepsis, more likely to have retinopathy of prematurity. So in general, they were a bit sicker and smaller than those we did not see. Here are our results. And in the blue is the less severe neurodevelopmental impairment, and in red is the more severe impairment. And so the first thing you see is that as we go from the most premature, 22 and 23 weeks, up to 28 weeks, each week the outcomes improve, and that is statistically significant. And in Canada, we have not had that evidence before, and particularly at the lowest birth weights, that's important to know. Again, this is a summary slide that looks at all the different secondary outcomes that we looked at. But what I want to highlight in this column here is the variation between sites. So if we look at cerebral palsy, which overall is 6.4%, there were some sites that were as low as 1.4% and others that were almost 29%. And for all the outcomes, we saw that there was significant differences between sites. The other thing in this table is, again, we have it divided by each week gestational age. And for all the outcomes, that the more mature babies do better. So in terms of the results of our regression analysis, I've summarized all the steps into this bar. On the y-axis is the odds ratio, and so if the result crosses 1, then it is not significant, but if it doesn't, then it is statistically significant. So we've selected out the variables that are significant here. As I've just shown you, gestational age is important. Boys do worse than females. If you are born in a hospital that's not one of our level 3 NICUs, then you do worse. If you have a higher severity of illness, you do worse. Bronchopulmonary dysplasia, you do worse. Necrotizing enterocolitis, you do worse. And the highest predictor is having brain injury as seen on head ultrasound. So what happens when we look at severe neurodevelopmental impairment, and we have a slightly different pattern of risk factors. Not surprisingly, some are the same, such as gestational age, sex, severity of illness, and brain injury. But in this model, retinopathy, severe grade 3 or higher, and nosocomial infection are also significant determinants. And when we look at severe neurodevelopmental impairment or death, we see sort of a similar pattern with gestational age, sex, severity of illness, and brain injury being the important variables. We then, having adjusted for those variables, we then looked at what is the difference between different NICUs across the country. And you'll see that it's up and down all over the place. Again, if the line crosses 1, that means there's a statistically significant difference. And so you'll see that some sites are higher, like this one and this one. When we then look at severe neurodevelopmental impairment, again we have one site here who seems to be doing very much better because the odds ratio is 0.04, so that means they have 1/25th the incidence of severe impairment. And then site J has more than 3 times the median. So there's 25 times 3. There's a 75-fold difference between this site and this site. So we've used the same idea in the Canadian neonatal network that when we have these variations, it's actually an opportunity to learn from each other and find out what are some sites doing that lead to better outcomes, and seeing if that can't be a strategy to helping the long-term outcomes. We have done this in the Canadian neonatal network in terms of decreasing our incidence of infection, of retinopathy of prematurity, a bit of bronchopulmonary dysplasia, but less so with intraventricular hemorrhage. So our long-term plan will be to do something similar to see if we can't learn how to improve these neurodevelopmental impairment rates, which really haven't improved in Canada over many years. again, when you include death in this one, we still have a lot of variation between site A, which is doing very well, and site J, which is more than threefold higher. So how does this fit with what has published in the literature? So we looked at the Express group in Sweden. Now, we're less than 29 weeks, they're less than 27 weeks. Their incidence of cerebral palsy is just slightly higher than us. They reported on mean Bailey 3 cognitive language and motor scores. And they have done very well when you think that the mean for the Bailey is 100, and they have 94, 98, 94. In Canada, we seem to be doing quite well on the cognitive, but not as well on the language and motor. Lex Doyle and Peter Anderson in Australia have reported on less than 28 weeks, and they're similar in our cognitive, but we're not doing quite as well on the language and motor as they are. In terms of cerebral palsy, in the United Kingdom, they had a much higher rate of cerebral palsy of 11%. So, in conclusion, our clinicians felt that it was important that we express this not always in a negative way, but in the positive way, that 84% of survivors are free of severe impairment, with obviously different rates by gestational age. And when we look at what the determinants of adverse outcome are, well, gestational age is, we have not done very well at preventing prematurity. We can't change sex. We can be vigilant at making sure that mothers receive antenatal steroids. We might be able to do better at admitting mothers rather than babies before they deliver. And I don't know whether we can improve our resuscitation and thereby reduce the number of babies who have a low APGAR score. And likewise, I don't know, but I think we might be able to have babies who are born in better condition at birth. In the Canadian Neonatal Network, we are successfully managing to reduce our bronchopulmonary dysplasia, necrotizing enterocolitis, retinopathy of prematurity, and nosocomial infection rates. So we think we can do better there. And we are currently working on developing a grant where we'll be working more closely with the obstetricians and thinking that that might be a better strategy to reduce severe brain injury. And then we do think that we can learn from each other to see why some sites were doing better. So this comes from the Canadian Neonatal Network annual report. It's called a pedal chart. And if we look, this is 18 in the green. This is site A. And so you can, that odds ratio of 1 means that if you are on the inside, you're doing better than the median. And you can see here that site 18 has a lower death rate, infection rate is the same as average, and then they also have a low IVH rate, retinopathy of prematurity, BPD, and NEC. And so to finish off, I want to share a study that I'm doing with a master's student, Matt Haslam, who's working with us, and we wanted to look at how big a difference it makes depending upon which definition you use to define impairment. And, yeah, so we looked at different definitions that were used by the follow-up networks that we could find through the internet or PubMed, and then we applied those definitions to our Canadian follow-up network database. So we ended up with 7 definitions, and the different components that had varied by the definitions was the severity of cerebral palsy, the cutoffs they used on the Bailey 3, the definition of hearing impairment, and and this is the Canadian follow-up network definition, and this is the most restrictive definition. And so we were struck by the difference between close to 5% versus 16% is more than a 3-fold difference, which I think for most of us, if you're told there's a chance of a 5% risk of severe impairment versus a 15%, that's a big enough difference to be important. The next thing we did is we looked at regression analyses, and we said, would we come to different conclusions depending upon which, whether we used the definition that gave us the highest incidence or the definition that gave us the lowest incidence. And obviously the highest incidence means that you have bigger numbers, you have more power to show a difference in your study, which may explain part of why there were more variables that were significant. But it wasn't strictly that, because in the highest incidence, bronchopulmonary dysplasia was not significant, but it was in the lowest incidence definition. And so the things that varied were when we looked at the ethnic background, and we had Caucasian, and we had Black, and then we had First Nations, our Aboriginals, and our Aboriginals here have an almost 3-fold higher incidence of adverse outcome. And so, whereas gestational age, much to my surprise, and sex did not come up as significant in this definition. So we showed that which definition you use impacts incidence rate. It impacts the results of what are considered significant predictors. And these are the numbers that are used for counseling our families. They're used for developing, at least in Canada and many other countries, what are going to be the guidelines for resuscitation. But we haven't had any parent input on terms of what are the outcomes and definitions that matter. So just to let you know, we do have about 24 other projects that we are in progress in the CN Fund. And if you have any questions about any of these, I would be happy to answer them. And I agree in the introduction that I'm the fortunate person to be speaking to you now, but it is not without all the hard work done by all our sites and the families who traveled to come and see us that this was all possible. Okay. So funding from this project came through our Canadian Institute of Health Research as part of the study that we called the CIHR team in maternal infant care, or MyCare for short. And at that point, I will finish, and I think we'll do questions at the end.
Ujú.